morning. My name is Richard Wexler, and this is Caring in America, the podcast for caregivers and care recipients. We have a special guest today, Eddie Chao. I'm about to introduce him. Eddie is a results-oriented director of business development and an operations manager with Amada Senior Care. He has over 16 years of experience in leadership and team management. He has a proven track record of success, having led teams of up to 27 people. He has a logistically minded approach that allows Eddie to make informed decisions and ensure smooth operations. He brings a unique ability to identify new opportunities and develop partnerships. Eddie, are you there, sir? Welcome. I hope you're doing well on this a little overcast Tuesday morning.
I am. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, thank you. So I know that you kind of have a different background. I would really be curious for our audience to hear more about your background and then how that got you into the senior care industry.
Sure. So I didn't start off in the healthcare realm. My actual first position outside of, as soon as I graduated from college, was actually in the insurance world on the life and health side of things. You can say that there were touch points with seniors due to products that we had with life insurance and long-term care insurance. But mainly it was a lot of estate planning. And then, of course, after '07, '08, where the housing market crashed, let's say circumstances led me into the healthcare realm and have been in healthcare ever since.
Interesting. And then, so kind of tell me about the steps then of getting into to senior care from healthcare, et cetera.
Sure. So you could say that I've been in geriatrics all my life. My mother actually started in the assisted living industry in 1984 when I was a wee lad at
Wow.
the time. And at the time, visiting my mom's facility, we actually had our World War I veterans around at the time. And
Oh,
so
wow.
stories growing up, hearing just their experiences, a different era, and it was just rewarding growing up, having that kind of context, multi-generational context. And then, of course, that carried with me into my adult life, into my career life now, again, in geriatrics. So.
So was she operating like a large and assisted living, or was she operating something small? Can you kind of tell our audience?
Yeah, sure. So it was an 18-bed facility at the time. And so it wasn't one of the larger 150 or so bed type facilities. It was an 18-bed facility and different regulations back in California at the time, and even to this day, will have different regulations for different size assisted living facilities. So.
Wow. So did you spend, as a wee lad, did you spend a lot of time maybe wandering around that facility?
I sure did. So it was interesting. We lived on a 1 acre lot, and our house was on the back side of the lot, and the facility was on the front side towards the street. And so I remember as a kid coming home from school, grabbing a snack, and then going to help my mom
Wow.
in her facility. And again, whatever I could, obviously, as an adolescent at the time, doing what I can to help, and again, just sit and chat. And that was just it was great. It was so great.
I'm I mean, I'm kind of shaking my head because every kid grows up on a lot like that with the home in the back, and then I mean, that's everybody's life, right? No, I don't.
Totally.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I don't think so. But I mean, and you talk about, I'm imagining you met so many different people, men and women. I'm assuming, bad word, that were older, but did you spend a lot of time talking with them?
Yes, again, just hearing their stories during the World War I era, and then of course quickly into the World War II era. It is fascinating, the experience that they grew up with, their reality versus, you fast forward 60, 70 years, and like I said, it's literally a different era. It's a different paradigm, a different perspective, different time, in society. And so having that context, like I said, growing up, it just widens your perspective, and it allows you to have uh, a humble stance in how fortunate, some of the circumstances that we live in to today that they did not have back then. So
Wow. That's a really fascinating story, and like I said, and I kind of knew a little bit about your background, and I wanted my audience to hear this because it is quite unique. Now with Amada Senior Care, what's their origin story? Tell our audience about Amada.
sure. So Amada Senior Care was actually founded by our current CEO, Tafa Jefferson, and he is a retired NFL player. And due to a career-ending injury, he had to retire and was trying to find what to do right with the rest of his life, and asked his mom, who at the time was a caregiver, and she said, "Why don't you start a caregiving business?" And then now you fast forward 17 years later,
Wow.
we have over 180 stores nationally in about 42 states. So
Wow.
it's a pretty impressive story. Yeah.
Wow. And I'm in Idaho, that most people know in listening to this podcast. You are as well. What's Amada's objective in Idaho?
So Amada has two divisions. So mainly about 180 or so locations in the 42 states are franchise locations, independently owned and operated. I represent the corporate division. And so it's our first corporate store outside of California, where we're headquartered. And our objective here, our initiative, is to care for our senior veterans. So mainly those veterans demographically that are Vietnam era, Korean War era veterans. That's our objective here in Idaho, to be able to care for them and be their advocates and be their advisors.
Interesting. And I know, broad subject I've talked about a lot. Obviously, you in the industry very familiar with. I mean, we have to pay for care, and sometimes it's not that inexpensive. When you're dealing especially with veterans, can you talk about that? Typically paying for care, do they have resources through the VA? Can you inform our audience?
Absolutely, they absolutely do have resources. Now there are certain prerequisites, and that they have to meet in order to take advantage of these benefits. Number one is, are they service connected? Did they serve during wartime? If so, then each of these combat veterans would have a disability rating. They call it service connected disability rating, and if they meet that 70% threshold, then they are eligible for in-home caregiving through a certain benefit paid through the VA, and frequency per week will depend upon diagnosis and comorbidities. So it depends upon their situation that they're in. But absolutely, they can access these benefits that is, in my opinion, owed to them because they have sacrificed so much for their country.
Wow. Now, and I don't really even know the answer to this question, so obviously I'm going to ask you. They're married? Does a spouse have access to those benefits as well, or not?
So, not specifically for the caregiving aspect, but they are eligible for aid and attendance, which has to do with the monetary compensation that they can use towards care.
Interesting. So these individuals, and again, are most of them from the Vietnam era?
Most of our client population who needs help with the activities of daily living, right? A lot of the functions that we take for granted, eating, bathing, right, dressing, incontinence, stuff that obviously that would require um, assistance where they cannot, they're more dependent now as opposed to being independent, and so the geriatric, the wiser population are the ones that usually have that kind of need, as opposed to younger veterans who, even if they are disabled, can still function, more independently than those of our senior veterans that are 80 plus.
Sure, sure. So going back to the payment aspect, are you finding that most of these veterans are certainly aware of the benefits they're getting from the VA, or do you folks have to kind of enlighten them?
I think it's a mixture, Richard, because when our Korean War and our Vietnam veterans, when they came home and were discharged off service, they very, very sadly were not given a hero's welcome, and so disillusioned with society and the VA in general, they gravitated towards the civilian healthcare space,
Sure.
and many do not know. I just met with an individual recently, and they were in Vietnam and were not aware of the VA benefits to be able to help this individual who is now becoming less and less independent and more dependent for daily tasks. And so we have a very unique and privileged opportunity to be able to help our senior veterans access the benefits and the care that they need and that they rightly deserve.
That's fantastic because obviously I'm of that age of the Vietnam era. Um, didn't serve myself, but certainly understand what most of those veterans went through, and actually had some roommates that served in Vietnam, had some very intimate conversations with them. So I'm certainly aware of that era, and again, what they went through. When they get this benefit from the VA, is that normally taking care of all the expense for in-home care, or sometimes do they have to find other monies as well?
So that's a great question. I'll answer that in two parts. The first part is there is a certain frequency that the VA will authorize based upon this individual's diagnosis, comorbidities, what is the actual need from an ADL standpoint, and then the other aspect is depending upon priority group and your service connected. There's a threshold. 70% is that sweet spot where if they are 70% or above in their disability rating, then there is no share of cost. If they're below, we will work obviously with each individual that is below 70% to see if we can get them to that threshold of 70%, where there would be no share of cost. But even if they are above 70% and the VA authorizes a certain frequency and they need additional care, then that's where we could help to access other funding sources on top of that. So it isn't. It just depends. It really will depend on
Sure,
a case by case basis. But to obviously do as much as we can to access the maximum benefits that they deserve.
sure. So, folks, we're 16 minutes in, almost 17 minutes into our episode today, and I'm bringing up that four-letter word that you guys hear me talk about all the time that people hate, because I want to get Eddie's thoughts on this four-letter word as well, called plan. So, just in general, Eddie, we're getting older. We have almost 80 million baby boomers. We have another 30 million or so on top of that are their parents, grandparents that are still with us in this country. Approximately 110 million people per data that I have seen. So, what are your thoughts around this little tiny word called plan? Something my wife and I didn't do.
Sure. Yeah, how much time you got, Richard? So I'll be brief. Gosh, there's so much to cover. There's a lot to say, but I think I will lead with this. It is never, ever too early to start the conversation.
Thank
It
you.
is, it can be very uncomfortable when it comes to having that conversation with either your spouse or your adult children. But it is far, far better than being blindsided, drinking through a fire hose, and now not knowing what you don't know and having to navigate, let's say, your elderly parent and every aspect of care that pertains to, and while at the same time juggling your own career and caring for your children or teenage children. It is quite the ordeal. So the earlier that conversations can occur, the better off each family unit will be.
Have you been on the road with me? I mean, you sound just like me, Eddie. It's something I've been screaming about now for 15 plus years. Folks, you hear me talk about this episode after episode, and I wouldn't keep talking about we didn't plan. You don't want to be like us. And I tell people, most people aren't going to get all four parents to care for. One's tough enough. And as Eddie's talking, one's literally tough enough. It changes your life. And you're still trying to bring income in the family and still work and still have a life and still raise kids, this sandwich generation and so on and so forth. And it's never going to be easy, even when you plan. But I tell people it will be easier. And I've talked about this so many times. We plan so much in our life. We'll plan a vacation maybe on the East Coast of the Bahamas, on the West Coast of Hawaii, and we'll plan every aspect of it. But we just don't want to talk about this. And I get it, but we have to. So Eddie, as we kind of get ready to wrap up. Big subject, big question, but I kind of want to get your thoughts about the direction of the senior care industry again with almost 80 million baby boomers. The oldest are going to be 80, folks, in 2026. That's a little over a year from now. I'm still having a big problem comprehending that. The baby boomers turning 80. Eddie, what are your thoughts?
Sure. Gosh, that's also there's so many aspects and topics to talk about. But my biggest encouragement would go seek your friends and or professionals that are in the insurance industry and or even investment industry. What can we do to offset the burden of cost that we know is inevitably coming? Whether it's insurance through life insurance, that nowadays it's a little bit different than when I was selling insurance, but nowadays there's life insurance products that actually add a long-term care rider attaching it to the life insurance product. So there's that aspect. And then of course, through different investment firms, they will help you also, not just from a financial, but from a vehicle standpoint that will specifically offset the burden of care that we know, again, that we will all at one day arrive at and will need. So that would be my biggest encouragement, but have that conversation with friends, with family. Please, that is the best course of action, because someone is going to know someone. Those degrees of separation will be limited, and we will all be more informed, so that when it's time to make decisions, we can make wise and rational decisions, as opposed to being at the mercy of the urgent.
Thank you, sir. I very much appreciate that, folks. I mean, if you take nothing away from this, hopefully you take a lot. But what Eddie's saying is so important, and using a great company like Amada down the lines, getting involved, excuse me, in a partnership with Eddie and his company. I mean, it's huge. But that biggest thing, that little tiny word that I talk about all the time, cost, and as Eddie said, it's going to be most of us. I talk about the fact that about 95% of us are going to need care at some point in our lives. It may be a very small amount. It could be someplace in between. It could be years. But I mean, that is reality until somewhere way off in the future the human body changes. I won't be here, but somewhere way down the line, we're probably going to need care, excuse me, for a long time to come. If people want to get in contact with you, Eddie, what do you want to give out? Email, website? What? Please go ahead.
Sure. Yeah. I think the best way to get a hold of me would be to shoot me an email. I check my email constantly throughout the day. And my email is Eddie, EDDIE .c as in Charlie at AmadaSeniorCare.com.
Perfect. Perfect. Folks, this has been a great conversation with Eddie. I say on every episode, if you want to get in touch with me, best way is again through email, eldered2023@gmail.com. I want to thank Eddie again for a great conversation and great episode today. And folks, until we talk again, have yourself an awesome day.